This video will make it look like I hate the fantasy genre, but I want you to know that I actually do not hate the fantasy genre. Yesterday I made a video talking about the fantasy genre and why I love it and why it's my favorite genre. But I actually think I might have made a mistake because I don't think that video was as nuanced as I could have been. Because someone actually made a comment in that particular video that sparked a lot of things in my head that I didn't think of before. The name is Matt, and they made this particular comment, and I really appreciate that comment because it made me think about more than just, screw literary snobs. Because a lot of that video actually tackled literary snobs and the issue with the fantasy genre, because oftentimes literary snobs will say the entirety of the fantasy genre is escapism for children, and it's nothing more than that. And I really hate this particular generalization because it is false. And I've always had my favorite examples to always, point, oh, look at this book, you can read this book, you can read this other book, you can read that. And all of them, they tackle heavy thematic subjects and they have a lot of literary styling with them, as Brandon Sanderson puts it.
And the more I've thought about it, the more the question has been to me is, why not fantasy? You see, I feel like fantasy as a genre can do anything. This is great. This means that you can find in fantasy literary styling as great as the great literary classics. You can find a romance as powerful and passionate as anything in the romance genre. You can find a mystery as intriguing as any mystery, and it's all fantasy.
There is a huge issue with how I always defend the fantasy genre. A lot of the arguments I have used in the past to defend the fantasy genre have been using a minority book. In other words, the books I have used to defend the genre are a minority in the genre. I would like if fantasy books are actually recommended by professors and these in universities, and they actually give it to the students, and the students analyze the thematic content of fantasy books, because I love that. I love that a lot, and I want that for the fantasy genre. But that doesn't happen a lot. It happens sometimes, but it's not enough, at least compared to literary books, who are actually picked up all the time by professors and given to the students all the time. And in fact, sometimes if some university students pick up fantasy books as their book to analyze, sometimes the professor will actually be like, this is not a real book, this is not a real story. It happened to me, and I think it happened to one of my friends as well. And it sucks. I love the fantasy genre so much that I want this literary adoption to happen, and I want the genre to have a future. But in order for the genre to have a future, we have to look at the fantasy genre differently. We as the fantasy fans have to look at it differently. And I admit that the way I look at the fantasy genre is actually a minority, because most fantasy fans look at the fantasy genre as escapism. The way I look at the fantasy genre is, this genre is the most literary genre ever. The way I discovered fantasy is when I was a lot younger, I was trying to write a story and I was trying to critique God in that story. But I was actually very scared of critiquing actual God, and I didn't want to get, beaten or killed. So I actually, built this fictional world, and I started critiquing the God of some fictional tribe that happens to share a lot of roots with my culture. Guess what? What ended up happening is that fantasy helped me tell my literary story, because initially what I was writing was supposed to be a literary novel, and there was not really a lot of plot. In here, I wrote a fantasy story that was technically literary, but in another world with a bit of magic. And that is how I discovered fantasy. So the way I look at fantasy is that fantasy is the most literary genre there is. Why? Because you can explore literary subjects, but at the same time, you can stay away from real world baggage and troubles that you can face if you actually critique. But I am aware that this is not how people look at the fantasy genre. I know this is not how people look at the fantasy genre. And the defense I've always used, which is, oh, look at this book. It's a book in the fantasy genre that has literary styling in it. Well, that is actually a bad defense of the fantasy genre. This is crazy, because it means all that has to happen for the criticism of a lot of snobs to be honest and to ring true is to say most of fantasy is escapism. It is true. If you check and if you read a lot, you will notice that most fantasy books are not written with anything beyond escapism, and it's cool. And that to me is very sad, because I wish more for the fantasy genre To me, this is the greatest, opportunity I've had in my life, because it really might have saved my life. Yes, and that is how I see it. And I want more for this genre, man. I really want more for this genre. And I want people to start looking at it as more than escapism. But more crucially, I want fantasy fans to look at the fantasy genre as more than escapism, because it really is more than just escapism. It really is more than just dragons. It really is more than just wizards and magic. It honestly is more than that, because this is the greatest opportunity I have ever had in my life. And I love it for that. And I think I invite a lot of writers out there to actually use the genre for more, to have more thematic subject, more thematic content, and to have characters that develop, internally in major ways. Because a lot of fantasy protagonists, while they do develop, they develop externally. In other words, for instance, the protagonist will become a king or a prince or a gang leader, and they will climb the social hierarchy. But internally, they don't change. I want people to actually start looking more into positive and negative arcs. A positive arc would be the character learning, and the negative arc would be the character becoming sort of a demon and losing the truth. And a lot of fantasy stories are not written with this in mind. Why? Because the protagonist is an angel and the enemy is a dark lord. Literally, they have Dark Lord in the name. Of course, that's not modern fantasy. A lot of modern fantasy does not do that. They don't have the perfect angel as a protagonist, and they don't have the unremorseful demon as a villain. But again, at the same time, a lot of modern fantasy still has flat character arcs. In literary, that is rare. It's rare to find a protagonist that is flat, that does not change internally most of the time, right? Again, all of this is internal change. It's learning to be better, right? And honestly, all it boils down to is that my defense of the fantasy genre is kind of weak, because guess what? At the end of the day, most of fantasy is written with the intention of escapism and nothing more. That is me critiquing my favorite genre, but then again, I'm not really going to pretend that it's perfect. I'm not going to pretend that I'm blind to its flaws, because it does have flaws. And again, it's really fine. We can disagree on this particular topic. Tell me what you think down in the comments below. I do daily uploads, and hey, please consider subscribing if you enjoyed this. Have a nice day.